On their wedding anniversary, I walked into the house I helped build, only to be told, "There's no seat for you tonight. Maybe just stay downstairs." No anger, no cruelty, just dismissal dressed in politeness. The words came from my daughter-in-law, said lightly, like a casual suggestion, but they landed with the weight of a verdict. A few guests turned to glance at me, none said a word, and my son, he just looked away. That was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. They didn't need to lock a door to shut me out. They simply stopped making room. I stood there, holding the small gift I had brought, a bottle of wine they once said they loved, wrapped neatly with a card I had written by hand. I looked toward the dining room. Every chair was full, every plate set, every glass raised, except for mine. There was no space, not even at the end. I wasn't late. I wasn't forgotten. I was uninvited by omission. My son stepped toward me. His voice was quiet, not apologetic. "Maybe it's just easier this way," he said, as if family should be convenient, as if my presence after everything was something to be managed, not honored. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the sounds of celebration wash over me like a wave I no longer belonged to. Laughter, toasts, music, and yet none of it reached me, because something colder had taken its place. Realization. It wasn't just that they didn't save me a seat. It was that they had slowly moved the entire table to another room and closed the door behind them. And for the first time, truly, fully, I understood. They didn't want me there. Not as decoration. Not as obligation. Not even as memory. I nodded, as if to say I understand. But inside something shifted. Not rage, not bitterness, but a line being drawn. Quietly, clearly. I turned, gift still in hand, and walked back out into the night. They were celebrating love. Anniversary. Commitment. And I, the man who had shown them what loyalty looks like, was standing outside. Uninvited, unwanted, unnecessary. The porch light flickered behind me as the door closed. I didn't knock again, didn't linger. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is walk away without needing them to follow. Friends, let me take a short pause here. Could you please write in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to others. Now let's continue. They celebrated on the rooftop that night, string lights dancing above them, laughter spilling over the railing like champagne, the soft beat of music echoing against the warm evening sky. From below, it looked perfect. A picture of family, of joy, of togetherness. I stood at the bottom of the staircase, a tray of pastries in my hands, waiting, hoping, maybe foolishly, for someone to wave me up, to say, "Come join us," to notice. Instead, it was my daughter-in-law who peeked her head down the stairs and said with a gentle smile, "It's pretty crowded up here. Maybe better if you stay downstairs, just until some people leave." She didn't say it cruelly. In fact, she said it sweetly, too sweetly, like someone pushing you away with velvet gloves. I nodded. Of course, I didn't want to be in the way, except it was my house. The rooftop they toasted on? I had paid for it when my son and his wife were still saving for furniture. The railing that kept their guests safe? I installed it myself one winter weekend. The very floor beneath their feet had been poured by a friend of mine I hired as a favor, because they couldn't afford a contractor. I knew every nail in those boards, every angle of that view, but now I wasn't part of it. I sat alone in the downstairs kitchen, the pastry still on the tray, untouched. Through the open window, I could hear a toast, someone raising a glass, a cheer. My name wasn't mentioned. It hadn't been in a long time. I poured myself a glass of water. There was a time, not long ago, when I would have stood beside my son in those moments, when we would have clinked glasses, when his friends would have shaken my hand and said, "You raised a good man." Now I was the man downstairs, the one they asked to stay back, not because there was no room, but because there was no longer place. And maybe that was worse. I looked around the room. It was filled with the furniture I had helped them buy, the pictures on the walls, their wedding, their travels, their perfect little life, and in none of them was I present. I had built the walls, but I was no longer welcome inside them. They say betrayal is loud, a slammed door, a shouted word, but the deepest betrayal is quiet. It's a polite smile. It's being asked to wait downstairs in your own home. It's being erased while still standing in the room. That night I didn't go back up, not because there wasn't room, but because I finally understood. They weren't asking me to wait. They were asking me to disappear. The party was still going strong upstairs, laughter echoing, music pulsing through the beams I once helped install. I had been sitting alone for nearly an hour, trying to convince myself that this was fine, that I was fine, that maybe I was overthinking, as they always used to say when I asked too many questions with quiet eyes. But I remembered the gift, a small wooden box I had carved myself, smooth edges, hand-polished, tucked in the back closet for safekeeping. I had spent days on it, not because it was grand, but because it was personal, the kind of thing you passed down, if people still believed in that sort of thing. I walked down the narrow hallway, the floor creaking under my weight, just as it had for years. It was the same hallway I carried my son down when he had chicken pox and couldn't sleep. The same one I had painted 3 times, always the wrong color, until my wife finally picked one herself. The door to the storage room was cracked open. I reached for the knob quietly, and that's when I heard it. A voice. Her voice. My daughter-in-law. Low, hushed, casual. The kind of tone people use when they think no one is listening, or when they're sure the one who matters least is too far away to care. He's sweet, sure, she said. But let's be honest. He didn't really leave anything behind, did he? No investments, no properties, no trust fund, just presence. And then laughter. Soft, sharp. Like the clinking of crystal. Someone else chimed in. Well, presence doesn't pay for college. Another chuckle. Then silence. They moved on to the next topic. Menu choices, maybe. But I was no longer in the room. I was behind the curtain, holding my breath, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I didn't say a word, didn't step in. I simply turned and walked away. Not from anger, from understanding. They saw my life as empty, because it wasn't decorated with wealth, wrapped in titles, or hanging on office walls. They saw my presence, the years I spent repairing, providing, protecting, as nothing more than background noise. They didn't know about the nights I stayed up worrying about bills, so they wouldn't have to. The times I gave up travel, hobbies, rest, not because I couldn't afford them, but because they needed more. They didn't know how many broken things I fixed before anyone noticed they were broken. Because I never announced what I carried, I just carried it. And now all they remembered was the silence. Not the weight. I returned to the living room, gift in hand, and sat in the same chair. The walls felt colder, not because of what was said, but because of what had been true all along. To them I had become a presence, familiar, convenient, forgettable. But what they didn't realize, not yet, was that presence can hold everything together. And when it finally leaves, everything they stood on begins to shift. The hallway was quiet now, dimly lit by a single antique lamp I had bought decades ago, back when the house was still being filled with things that mattered, back when every photo hung on the walls was a future memory, not a filtered presentation of image and status. I walked slowly, almost afraid of what I was already beginning to feel. There it was, a gallery wall, at least 24 frames, all curated with a designer's precision, matching gold trims, white borders, even spacing. A perfect rectangle of smiles, of posed moments, of polished joy. It stretched from one end of the hallway to the other, like a timeline that had carefully excluded anything inconvenient. I stepped closer, hands folded behind my back like a visitor in a museum. And then I saw it, frame after frame, year after year. Weddings, baby showers, New Year's Eves, the christening of my first grandson, graduations, family barbecues, even vacations I had helped pay for. They were all there, my son, his wife, their children, friends, cousins, extended relatives, but not me. I scanned each photo again, slower this time. Surely there had to be one, just one, even in the background. A hand, a shoulder, a blurred figure behind the cake table, something, nothing. I wasn't in any of them. It felt almost surgical, like someone had combed through the years with a scalpel and trimmed away my edges, my presence, my fingerprints. Not out of hate. No, hate would have left more clues. This was something colder, indifference refined into revision. I stared at a picture taken in the backyard. My old grill was in the corner. I recognized it instantly. I had bought it when my grandson was born. I remembered the night, how I stood over it for hours, flipping steaks while everyone laughed and took photos. I remember my back aching, the mosquito bites, the way I wiped sweat off my brow so no one would see. But in the photo, I wasn't there. The angle was cropped, tight, clean, as if the grill had appeared by itself, sizzling in celebration. And then something sharp slipped beneath my ribs. They didn't just stop including me. They rewrote the story as if I was never there at all. I moved back a step. My eyes searched for a blank space, a missing square where maybe, just maybe, a photo of me had fallen and hadn't been replaced yet. But the wall was full, entire, final. There was no room left for me. I remembered the time I held my grandson's tiny fingers in the hospital, afraid to breathe too loudly. The day I helped my son fix the leak under the kitchen sink, both of us soaked and laughing. The early mornings I drove their daughter to school so her parents could sleep in. None of those moments made it to the wall, not one. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small photo I kept in my wallet, me, my wife, and our son when he was 4. We were sitting on the old porch steps of our first house. The photo was faded now, but I remembered every second of that day. She had made lemonade, he had scraped his knee, I had carried them both in my arms at one point. I held the photo up next to the wall. It didn't match. Not in tone, not in lighting, not in purpose. This wall wasn't built for memory. It was built for display, and I was no longer part of the design. I slid the photo back into my wallet and stood there a few minutes longer, trying to swallow something that didn't have a name. A kind of invisible mourning, not for death, but for deletion. Then I turned away, not in anger, not even in grief, just in truth. Because the deeper betrayal isn't being forgotten, it's being rewritten. And tonight, as I walked back into the guest room with its closed door and turned down light, I realized they didn't need to hang me on the wall, because I was the one who had built it. And even if they never told the story right, the foundation still knew who I was. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because of noise. The celebration upstairs had long faded into clinking glasses and background laughter, but because something had settled deep inside me, something that didn't want rest. I lay on the guest bed, staring at the ceiling. The same ceiling I helped insulate when they ran out of budget. I remembered climbing the ladder, my joints already stiff back then, stuffing each sheet of fiberglass with aching fingers because they didn't want to hire outside help. My son had brought me lemonade halfway through, called me a machine, and I had laughed. Back then my presence was needed. Now it was just tolerated. And yet as I lay there, the question wasn't, how did they forget me? It was, why did I make it so easy for them to? I sat up, slowly. The clock blinked 1:07 a.m. The walls around me were painted a soft beige, impersonal, curated for resale. This wasn't home, not truly. But I knew where home was. Not this place. Not the house filled with filtered photos and rooftop parties I wasn't invited to. But the other one. The one I built with my own hands. It was smaller, farther away, tucked near the hillside, where the sky opened wider and the air always smelled of pine and quiet. They thought I sold it. Years ago when they moved into the city and begged me to be closer to everything. They offered to help me downsize, even called it a new chapter. But I never signed the deed. I never let it go. Because some roots aren't meant to be moved. And some doors, no matter how long they stay closed, always wait for the right key. I opened the drawer of the nightstand and reached inside. Beneath some folded papers and an unused phone charger was a small brass key, still smooth, still warm to the touch, as if it remembered me too. I held it for a moment. Then I stood. No note, no goodbyes, no dramatic exits. Just me, quietly reclaiming something they had long stopped asking about. The drive out of the city was dark and silent. The roads stretched like a ribbon of memory, each curve familiar, each shadow a reminder of what once was. I arrived just before dawn. The old house was waiting, still nestled against the trees, still untouched by modern hands. The porch light flickered to life as I stepped out of the car, not because it was motion activated, but because I had wired it that way myself, long before anyone needed such features. The key slid into the lock without resistance, and when the door creaked open, the smell of wood and dust and time rushed to greet me. Not musty, not forgotten, just real, lived in, honest. I stepped inside. The furniture was simple, a little worn, but every chair still held the shape of conversations. Every photo still included me. Every wall, even in its quiet, fading paint, remembered. But it was the balcony I had come for. I climbed the stairs and stepped out onto the old wooden platform that overlooked the valley. The boards groaned under my weight, but held. They always had. From here, I could see everything: the forest breathing in the morning mist, the hills rolling softly into the distance, and far, far off in the horizon, just barely visible, the city, their house, their rooftop, their celebration. But from here it looked small, distant, and somehow less real. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the thermos I kept here, sat down in the old chair with the squeaky leg, wrapped myself in the wool blanket my wife once loved, and I breathed. Because this was the real balcony. Not the one dressed in fairy lights and glass railings, but the one that saw everything, including what was being forgotten. They could have their view, their noise, their curated story. But up here I had something better. I had perspective. And the quiet truth that some things, the most important things, can't be erased. Not by photos, not by whispers, not by locked doors. Because legacy doesn't need to be seen to still stand. The morning after I returned to the old house, I sat at the kitchen table where time had always moved slower. Not because the clocks ticked differently here, but because the silence was respected, honored. Nothing rushed in this place. Not meals, not words, not emotions, especially not truth. I made coffee the way I always had. Black, strong, with a little bit of cinnamon my wife used to add when the seasons changed. I let it sit and steam beside me as I reached into the drawer and pulled out an old notepad. Yellowed pages, torn edges, the kind they don't sell anymore. The pen I chose wasn't fancy. It skipped sometimes, but that felt right. Some things are meant to come through imperfect, like memory. I placed the notepad in front of me, breathed in the stillness, and began to write. Not with anger, not with blame, but with clarity. The kind that comes only when you've watched enough time pass, without anyone asking why your hands were always full and your mouth always quiet. I didn't address the letter to anyone specific. It wasn't just for one person. It was for all of them, anyone who ever looked through me, past me, or over me, and called that love. Line by line, I wrote what they never wanted to hear, that I noticed, every time I was left out of a photo. Every time I was thanked for the meal, but not for the years that paid for it. Every time my wisdom was dismissed because it didn't come from a screen or a spreadsheet. Every time I was spoken to like a relic instead of a man still breathing. I told them that I remembered, not in bitterness, but in detail. The nights I stayed awake doing the math so they wouldn't feel the shortage. The things I sold quietly to pay for their beginnings. The tears I never let fall, because fathers don't cry in front of doors they still hold open. I told them that presence is not passive. That my silence was not weakness, but love in its rawest form. Love that doesn't perform. Love that lifts, carries, covers. Love that doesn't ask for credit until it's erased. I told them I forgave them, but not because they asked, because I needed to let go of the ache before it turned into something colder. I didn't ask them to apologize. I didn't ask them to change. I only asked them to remember. To sit one day, when the house is quiet and the hallway photos begin to fade, and ask themselves a question. Who built this? Who gave without being thanked? Whose hands shaped the very floor beneath our joy? And I told them, when that day comes, if it comes, they will find the answer not in photos or in stories they told at parties, but in what they chose not to see. I folded the letter slowly, pressed the crease with my thumb like a seal. It wasn't long, it wasn't dramatic, but it was true. And truth, once written, doesn't beg to be read. It just waits, patiently, unmoved. I slipped it into an envelope, wrote nothing on the front, just placed it on their kitchen table. The same table they set for guests, the one they forgot to leave space at the night I stood holding a gift they never opened. And then I left. No door slammed, no scene, because I hadn't written the letter to change them. I had written it to finally stop disappearing. The night sky was beginning to darken, that deep purplish blue that means something's about to start. The rooftop celebration above was growing louder. Laughter, footsteps, glasses clinking, music swelling with synthetic joy. From where I stood downstairs, it felt like I was listening to a life that had already moved on without me. The kitchen lights were still on, warm, inviting, but falsely so, like the flicker of a candle in a window you know isn't meant for you. The house itself had no idea it had become hollow, that it now carried more echo than memory. I stood there for a moment, just inside the back door. The letter in my hand felt heavier than it should have, though it only held a few pages. But sometimes weight has nothing to do with mass, and everything to do with meaning. Their dog barked once from the hallway, then grew quiet. Even he had stopped running to greet me these days. I suppose animals learn from the people they live with. I walked across the kitchen floor slowly, my steps familiar, my heartbeat not. My reflection stared back at me faintly in the darkened glass of the oven. A quiet figure, uncelebrated but not lost. On the table, a linen runner stretched beneath vases of flowers carefully arranged to impress their guests. Not to honor the past, just to photograph the moment. I reached forward and placed the envelope down between them, gently, intentionally. It didn't need to be seen tonight, but one day someone would notice it. Someone would find it when the lights were off and the house had grown quiet. Maybe when the party pictures had been archived, the social feeds moved on, and all that remained were the truths no one could post. That letter wasn't a goodbye. It was an invitation, not to chase me, but to remember me, properly, wholly, for the first time. From the hallway I could hear my grandson's laugh echo down the stairwell. Innocent, high-pitched, pure. He didn't know what was happening, not yet. He didn't know that sometimes a man has to leave quietly just to be seen. I didn't linger. Didn't look back at the hallway I had walked down 1,000 times. Didn't touch the doorframe my hand always rested on. Didn't pause at the family portraits that didn't include me. I stepped out into the cool air and closed the door behind me, softly. The night welcomed me with open arms. There was a breeze, the kind that carries the scent of something old and honest. The kind that knows your name even if no one else says it anymore. I got into my car, started the engine, and pulled away slowly. No screech, no statement. They were too busy to notice, which was exactly the point. And as I drove away, the first firework cracked open the sky, bright, loud, joyful. They would cheer, lift their glasses, pose for photos beneath the glow. And I would watch it all unfold, not from the rooftop, not from their stage, but from the real balcony, the one they never asked about, the one they never climbed, the one with the view they'll never understand. Because some fireworks aren't meant to be seen from where the noise is. Some are meant to be witnessed from the quiet, where truth sits with you in the dark and says, This is your freedom. I thought perhaps that someone would feel the door close. Not physically, no gust of wind, no slam, but somewhere deep in the fabric of family, in the silence that follows when presence slips away. I thought maybe one of them would pause mid-sentence, glance around and ask, Where did he go? Even quietly, even to themselves, but no one did. I had walked out unnoticed, like a shadow finally blending into the night it had long belonged to. No footsteps behind me, no voices calling my name, no hand on my shoulder asking me to stay. And that, more than anything said or not said, was the answer. It wasn't that they forgot. It's that they had already learned to live without me, long before I left the room. I walked down the path from their house, the same path I once helped pave. When they first moved in, it was all gravel and mud. My back ached for days after I laid the stones myself, brick by brick, while my son planned the furniture and his wife browsed for lighting. I didn't mind. I was building something for them. It was something with them, or so I thought. Now my footsteps echoed off those very stones, but no one heard them, because no one was listening. There was a time, years ago, when I couldn't take more than a few steps in this family without someone needing me. Dad, can you fix this? Grandpa, can you pick me up from school? Can you watch the house while we travel? I was woven into the very heartbeat of their days. But slowly, and then all at once, I became background. Reliable, predictable, invisible. It starts small. They forget to introduce you at parties. They share news with you secondhand. They say things like, "Oh, we didn't think you'd want to come." Until eventually you realize they've already built a version of their life where you're not in the picture. Not because they hate you, but because it's easier that way. And tonight, that truth was no longer painful. It was clarifying. I reached the edge of the street. Street lamps hummed gently, casting long shadows. Somewhere in the distance, music still floated down from the rooftop. Faint, faint like I had become. I stopped for a moment and looked back just once. The house stood tall, glowing from within, pulsing with celebration. It looked beautiful from the outside. Everything they wanted it to be. But I knew better. I knew what was missing, not my presence, my absence. Because that's what they had quietly rehearsed for. That's what they had slowly made room for by removing mine. And now the final rehearsal was complete. I had exited. No curtain call. No applause. No mention. The hardest part of walking away isn't the distance. It's realizing no one followed. And yet, even in that, maybe especially in that, there was something honest. Not cruel, just clear. I adjusted my coat as the wind picked up and turned toward the hill where the trees whispered with welcome, and I kept walking, not with grief, but with a kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop waiting to be seen. The tires crunched softly along the gravel as I turned off the main road, a road that had once led to everything and now led to something far quieter, but far more mine. The headlights swept across the trees, and through the clearing, there it was, my house. Not the one I helped finance for my son. Not the one where my name was removed from the mailbox to make space for the new generation. No, this was the real one. The house I had built in my 40s with tired hands and a full heart. Where walls were painted not to impress but to feel warm. Where shelves sagged just slightly under the weight of real books, not curated decorations. Where every squeak in the floorboards had a name. Where nothing was perfect. And nothing pretended to be. I parked just outside the porch, killed the engine, and let the silence come. No music, no voices, no lights left on. Just wind in the trees and the memory of every year that brought me here, and every person who had slowly drifted away from it. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and something softer. Time. Time that hadn't been repackaged or painted over. Time that lived in the cushions, the curtains, the edges of every photo still on the shelves. Photos where I was never missing. There was no need to explain myself to these walls. They remembered. They bore witness. My old boots were still by the door. My tools hung in the shed. The quilt on the couch still carried the scent of my wife's perfume, faint but stubborn, like she'd only just walked out of the room. And there, just beyond the living room, behind the creaky wooden door, was the staircase that led up to the balcony. Not a rooftop patio with polished stone and champagne flutes. Not a space borrowed for parties and social theater. A real balcony. Mine. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand brushing along the rail I had carved myself. The wood was rough, unfinished, but it held. It had always held. When I opened the balcony door, the wind met me like an old friend. Cool, familiar, without expectation. The night stretched wide before me. No city skyline, no noise. Just forest, stars, the distant hum of wind through branches, and sky. So much sky. And from here, I could see the lights of their house. Tiny now, flickering behind trees. And still, I knew, full of noise. Celebration. Faces smiling into phones. A family story still being told, with a key chapter missing. I didn't feel small watching from here. I felt anchored. This place, this balcony, didn't ask me to be more. It didn't need me to earn my seat. It didn't forget me when I left. It was here all along. Waiting. Remembering. I sat down in the old wooden chair, wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, and leaned back. The stars above were silent, but somehow they knew. They had seen it all. Every fire I had put out. Every meal I had skipped to feed others. Every maybe next time I had swallowed. And still, here I was, not bitter, not broken, just returned. The balcony creaked softly beneath me as I settled in. Not from weakness, but from welcome. This wasn't exile. This was home. Not the one with their pictures, but the one with my presence. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt found. From where I sat, high above the noise and the lights, I could see everything. Across the trees, through the branches gently swaying in the night breeze, a patch of distant glow marked their house. The celebration still in full swing. Strings of rooftop lights shimmered like stars trying too hard to be noticed. Music drifted faintly through the valley, diluted by distance, stripped of its cheer by the time it reached me. It was no longer a song, just sound, echoes of something I once built now pulsing without me. And above it all, the sky. So wide, so honest. A canvas without editing. It didn't care about invitations or forgotten names. It didn't shrink to accommodate anyone's pride. It simply was, vast and unashamed. I poured tea from the old thermos I had brought with me, its metal worn smooth by years of camping trips and solitary mornings. The steam curled up into the cool air, disappearing into the sky like breath finally released. I placed a folded blanket across my shoulders. The one she used to love, the one that always smelled faintly of home no matter how many years passed. And I waited. Not for someone to come, not for anyone to notice I was gone. I waited for the sky to open, for that first burst of light to break the quiet, because I knew what was coming. The fireworks. They'd planned them for weeks, timed, coordinated, set to a playlist I was never asked about. They had debated over colors, picked the perfect angle for drone footage, hired professionals to make it all memorable. But what they didn't realize was that the best view wasn't up close. It was here, where no one blocked your sight, where no one talked over the moment, where no one posed. They just sat, still, watching, waiting. I sipped the tea slowly, the warmth settling in my chest as my breath met the cool air. The wooden armrests of the chair held me like an old friend, quiet, steady, unchanged. Beneath my feet, the balcony didn't tremble. It had no reason to. It had held my weight through grief, through silence, through love, through being left behind. This balcony wasn't designed for display. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to witness. And tonight, it would witness something I never thought I'd see. A family celebrating the future, with no idea who made the ground steady enough to dance on. And I would watch. Not to feel pain, but to feel peace. Because sometimes dignity doesn't sit in the center of the crowd. Sometimes it sits wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea, and waiting for the sky to bloom. They had their stage. They had their lights. But this view they forgot, it belonged to me. And it was more than enough. The sky cracked open. A single streak of light tore through the night, followed by an explosion of color, crimson and gold blooming in the heavens like a wound made beautiful. It lit up the trees below for a heartbeat, casting long shadows over the ground and momentarily illuminating everything I had left behind. From the balcony, I could see it all. The glow of the rooftop, the silhouettes of figures raising glasses, the artificial flicker of celebration captured on someone's phone. Down there, the music swelled again. A cheer erupted. Another firework followed, louder, brighter. Blue this time, then green, then white. The night sky pulsed with bursts of planned joy. And I didn't flinch. I didn't applaud. I didn't reach for my phone. I simply watched, because I knew what they didn't. I knew that the sky wasn't celebrating them. It was celebrating the truth. And the truth was this. Down there, they toasted to success built on invisible shoulders. They smiled for cameras while omitting the hands that steadied their world. They laughed and danced atop stories they never bothered to finish reading. But up here, above them, beyond them, there was no need for revision. Up here, I could see clearly. Each firework bloomed and fell like a moment of memory, pieces of my life bursting open above me. That red one. The night I drove through a blizzard to deliver medicine for my sick granddaughter while her parents were out of town. That gold one? The hours I spent building their patio by hand so they could host friends they now invited me to avoid. The silver burst that followed. The letter I left on their table, still sealed, unread, waiting like I did for years. Each color, each sound. A memory, a sacrifice, a truth. And for once, they weren't hidden. They were lit, painted across the sky for no one to own, no one to distort. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. Freedom. Not the kind you earn by walking away from pain, but the kind you gain by no longer asking to be seen by those who choose to look elsewhere. The chair creaked softly beneath me as I leaned back, pulling the blanket higher around my shoulders. I took another sip of tea, its warmth grounding me as the sky flared again and again, each burst more extravagant than the last. But no matter how loud the fireworks roared below, they couldn't touch the stillness that held me here, because they were celebrating what they thought was the peak. And I was sitting where the truth had always lived. Above it, they would post videos tomorrow, talk about how perfect the night was, how beautiful the show, but they'd never know that the best view, the most honest view, was from this quiet balcony, with no applause, no spotlight, just a man, his tea, and a sky finally brave enough to explode with everything no one else dared to say. And that was the only celebration I needed. Morning came without ceremony. No thunder, no storm, just light, creeping gently into windows and across countertops, illuminating the places where truth had been left behind. The house was still. The party had ended hours ago. Guests gone, balloons half deflated, champagne glasses still sticky with celebration, and on the kitchen table, between an empty wine bottle and a folded cloth napkin, lay the envelope. untouched, unspoken, but not unseen. My son found it first. He entered the room barefoot, rubbing sleep from his eyes, expecting nothing. The quiet caught him off guard. The letter caught him more. He saw the handwriting and froze, not because he feared what it said, but because he already knew what it said, before even opening it. That's what guilt does. It makes the truth louder than paper. He sat down, carefully, like the chair might collapse under the weight of what had been ignored for too long. He opened the envelope. No shaking hands, no dramatic pause, just silence. And reading, line by line, word by word, truth by truth. I hadn't written it to wound him. I had written it so he'd finally see me without needing to be defended against. And as he read, the weight in his shoulders shifted, the slow collapse of someone realizing the cost of comfort, of convenience, of not asking questions until the answers were gone. He didn't cry. He just sat there, still, gripping the paper as if it might fly away. His wife entered a few minutes later. She saw the letter in his hands. He didn't need to explain. She reached for it, read the first few lines, and stopped. Her hand covered her mouth. And then the tears came. Not loud, but real. Tears not of sadness, but of shame. Of understanding the difference between a guest in your home and the man who built the home. The quiet man who never demanded a seat, because he was too busy holding up the ceiling. Later that morning, my grandson came down the stairs, sleepy-eyed, curious, unaware. He saw them at the table, saw the letter, asked nothing. He simply walked over, looked at them both, and gently took the paper from his father's hands. No one stopped him. He read it slowly, lips moving silently the way children do when they're trying to feel each word. His eyes lingered at the end. Then he folded it, not sloppily like a child, but carefully, like it mattered. And without a word, he slipped the letter into his backpack. No drama, no permission asked. He just took it, because sometimes children recognize legacy before adults do. Not in what you leave behind, but in the silence you leave it in. He didn't say, "I understand." He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't need to. He just carried it with him, and that was enough. Because I hadn't written that letter to spark regret. I had written it for the one who would carry the memory forward, not out of guilt, but out of honor. And that morning, as my son sat in silence, and his wife wiped her eyes, and my grandson zipped up his bag, the truth finally had a home. Days passed, then a week, and the phone never rang. No calls, no texts, no apologies rushed out in trembling voices, no explanations wrapped in discomfort, just silence, not sudden, not cruel, but absolute. And in that silence, there was no surprise, because I already knew. Truth doesn't echo in houses that were built to filter sound. It simply leaves. They didn't reach out, not because they didn't feel something, but because they didn't know how to feel it. Because when truth finally walks through a room, it rearranges everything. And some people would rather sit in the rubble than admit what the walls were made of. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore. The absence of contact wasn't rejection, it was consequence. They had spent years building a version of family that was tidy, presentable, easy to explain. And then the letter came, and it didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It simply stood in the doorway and said, "Look again." And so they did. And what they saw in the reflection was not the man they had edited out, but the parts of themselves they didn't want to acknowledge. I imagined the house in the days that followed. Still beautiful, still full of curated charm, but quieter. Not because I was gone, but because something else had gone with me. The foundation of their illusion. Now each photo on the wall had a question floating beside it. Every gap in a story had a new weight. Every room I had helped shape was now a whisper of what was forgotten. I didn't need to hear from them to know. I felt it, the way you feel a building shift even when you're outside. Because when truth leaves a place, it doesn't slam the door. It just takes the warmth with it. And they were cold now. Not from winter, but from recognition. Meanwhile, I woke each morning to the sounds of wind in the trees and birdsong on the sill. No calendar, no expectation. Just the soft rhythm of life, unbothered and honest. There was no ache in me anymore. Only breath. Only stillness. I sat on the balcony some evenings, watching the stars return to their places. The ones I had once stared at while they toasted to a man who was already slipping out of their stories. And yet, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt real. Maybe for the first time in years. Not because someone reminded me, but because no one could erase me anymore. Their silence wasn't victory. It was proof. Proof that something had shifted in that house. Not just a man missing, but a presence removed. Not from spite, from truth. And now the noise was gone, and all that remained was a silence that finally told the truth. They never had the courage to say out loud. It was just past noon when I heard the sound of tires on gravel, slow, unsure, as if the driver wasn't quite certain they belonged on this road. The birds didn't pause their songs. The wind in the trees continued its soft conversation. But I stopped, not from surprise, but from something deeper, a stirring, a knowing. I stood at the window, half expecting to be wrong, but it was him, my grandson, alone. No text, no warning, no parent in the driver's seat. Just a boy, not quite a man yet, but with shoulders already learning the weight of inheritance, stepping out of the car with hesitant purpose, a backpack slung over one arm, the same one where he had tucked the letter away. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He just walked up the steps, quietly, the way you enter a place not as a guest, but as someone finally coming home to something they never realized was missing. I opened the door before he reached it. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. He looked up at me, not with pity, not with guilt, but with eyes wide open. Eyes that had read something, felt something, carried something, and in them I didn't see the child who once climbed my knees for stories. I saw the first thread of a man, one who now understood. I stepped aside. He entered. His gaze swept across the old wooden walls, the photos that had never been taken down, the chair that still leaned slightly to the left. He didn't smile. He didn't pretend to be impressed. He just noticed. And that was everything. He followed me out to the balcony. The same chair was there waiting for me, the blanket folded, the thermos ready. I poured a second cup without asking, handed it to him. He took it. We sat. The sky was quiet that afternoon. No fireworks, no noise, just clouds drifting with nowhere to be, like old souls stretching out for a while. Still no words. But his presence, unhurried, unforced, said more than an apology ever could. He didn't ask why I left, didn't try to explain their silence. He didn't speak of the letter, though I saw it in his bag, edges worn, creased like it had been opened more than once. He just stayed. We watched the valley below, watched a hawk circle and the trees lean toward one another. Time passed, tea cooled, and in that quiet something sacred happened. I felt seen, not because he said the right thing, but because he had chosen to sit beside the truth, without needing to fix it. We didn't rebuild history that day. We didn't name the wounds. We didn't write a new chapter. But we opened the door, together, without forcing it, without pretending the house was never cold. And when the sun began to set and he finally stood, he looked at me for a long moment. No performance, no promises, just something deeply present. Then he placed his hand on my shoulder, gently, steady, and in that small, wordless gesture, I felt it. Not reconciliation, not redemption, but something quieter, stronger, remembrance. And sometimes that's all legacy asks for. Not glory, not loud forgiveness. Just the quiet return of someone who says, with silence alone, I still carry you. And that day, on the balcony they never climbed, my grandson stayed. And that was more than enough. Every year on the same evening, I return to the balcony before the first firework cracks open the sky. I don't mark it on a calendar, I don't set a reminder, my body simply remembers. The air feels a little heavier that day, not with pain, but with memory. Not sorrow, something quieter, something deeper, something like peace, hard-earned. I prepare the same way each time. 2 mugs, a thermos of tea, and a single chair beside mine. Old, creaky waiting. Not for the past, but for the only part of the future I still believe in. He always comes. My grandson, now taller, older, with more weight in his eyes and less need for words. He arrives carrying a pie. The same kind his grandmother used to make, with imperfect edges and a slice missing because, as he once told me, I had to test it. He says little when he arrives. I say even less. We sit. The sky begins to dim, and together we wait for the show. Below, the city glows. The same rooftop fills with people I no longer recognize, or perhaps never truly did. Music plays. Laughter rises. A new generation takes their places at a table that forgot where its legs came from. But I don't feel bitterness watching them. Only distance. Only clarity. Because what I left behind wasn't my family. It was the illusion that I had to keep proving I belonged in it. I didn't walk away to punish them. I didn't leave hoping they'd chase after me. I left because staying meant losing the last parts of myself that still felt whole, and I had already given too much away in silence. On this balcony, high above the noise, beneath a sky that asks nothing of me, I am not missing. I am restored. The fireworks begin. The first one bursts like a soft thunderclap, lighting the valley in gold. Then another, red, then green, then blue, each bloom brighter than the last. He doesn't cheer. He doesn't clap. He just sits beside me, pie in his lap, tea cooling in his hands. And in that stillness between explosions, I realize something that no toast, no apology, no framed photograph could ever give me. I was never the absence. I was always the foundation, even when they forgot, even when they left me off the guest list, even when they called me just presence. Because presence built the roof over their heads. Presence held the screws in place, poured the first slab, paid the bills they never saw. Presence stayed through every unspoken dismissal, every time I was told with a smile that maybe this year we'll do something simpler. Now every firework above us is a hymn, not to the celebration they think they're having, but to the quiet man who stopped waiting to be invited. We don't talk about it, my grandson and I. We never speak of that night, or the letter, or the silence that followed, because truth, when it is finally lived, does not demand to be spoken. It just stays, and so do we. 2 chairs, 1 pie, 1 sky, and a freedom that explodes not in color, but in dignity. They had their fireworks, but this balcony, this silence, this remembrance was mine, and it was more powerful than any sky they ever lit.